England in the 14th century would go through some of the most turbulent periods of royal history, from the death of Edward I, known as Longshanks, through to the deposition of Richard II at the hands of his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke. This century had it all: royal drama, scandalous love affairs, famine, plague, wars, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. To discuss it all, I'm thrilled to welcome historian and author Helen Carr onto the podcast for the first time. Helen's latest book, Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century, is the backbone for our conversation. A conversation which will actually be, for the first time, a two-parter. And so today we'll be covering the story of King Edward II. Was he actually in love with male favourites? Was he to blame for all that befell his people? And of course, I'm sure you all want to know, did he actually die from having a red-hot poker up where you really, really don't want a red-hot poker? Well, keep listening to find out. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 92, Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century, part 1, with Helen Carr. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast. Helen Carr, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited that you're on the podcast. You're actually going to be my first time two-part episode because you're here to talk about your latest book, Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century. There's so much in there and it's impossible for us to get through it all in one episode, which is why we're going to be splitting it over two. Before we get into the discussion, though, about effectively the first third of the story, focusing on Edward II, a few questions to get to know you a bit better, if that's okay.
Of course.
So could you provide me with a short introduction into your background, so where you grew up and what you now do full time?
Yeah. So I grew up in the West Country, and I think that my interaction with the landscape of Somerset and Wiltshire was a big influence on my love of history going forward, because I grew up near places like the Avebury Stones, Farley Hungerford Castle, which was one of John of Gaunt's castles. And there's been a lot of history. I mean, I wasn't far from Stonehenge, from the historic city of Bath. I was very lucky to be surrounded by history, and history was something that I loved from a really, really young age. I think it's something that was entirely vocational. I grew up on a farm, and at the top of my farm there was a field that was originally used as a Victorian rubbish pit, so it was a dump, and I used to go up and dig up there, and I still have amazing little like glass bottles and pottery that I found when I was about 7 or 8 years old, and so for a while I thought I might be an archaeologist, and then I realised that was quite a science-based discipline. So but I'd always been fascinated with history, and I think that one of the other leading one of the other things that really led me to it was the fact that my great-grandfather was a historian, and that was something that had been I had been aware of from a very young age, and my dad talked to me about, and it just sounded quite magical. You know, this job as a historian, like that can be my job, that I can learn about the past and think about the past. And I think, yes, it was just a huge part of my life from a very young age. And I was fortunate enough to have parents who would really invest in that and take me to places and kind of make it very magical for me. And then now I am a full-time writer. I work as an academic as well at Queen Mary University, where I'm still finishing my long PhD, which should be finished soon. And I balance that with writing popular history and narrative history, but also I work on public history. So I think that how we think about history, how we do history, and the rigor of history is very important to me, and how young people can understand the past and use it as something to benefit them in the present in relation to source material and critical thinking and historiography. So I think I'm a public historian, but the practice and the methodology of history is something that fascinates me and that I enjoy very much. So I like to think that I am bridging a gap between the academic and the popular.
You mentioned Farley Hungerford Castle there a moment ago. That was where Margaret Pole was born.
That's it.
Yeah.
Interesting. An old Plantagenet stronghold.
Yeah. So in your childhood, can you recall a moment that sparked your love for medieval history? Because you're not, as you said to me before we actually pressed record, you're not a Tudor historian. You are a medieval historian, a Plantagenet historian. It's an era that I am becoming more fascinated by with every passing day. But people do tend to go straight into the Tudors and then they'll either go backwards to the Plantagenets or they'll go forwards into the Stuarts. You went straight to the medieval, as best I can tell. So was there a moment that sparked your passion for this window of history?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I've got children, and I have this theory that kids have two gateway drugs to history, and they are either the Tudors or the Egyptians. And my daughter kind of went with the Egyptians, and her friend very much went down the Tudor line and the interest in the wives. And it's quite funny to see my daughter, not being particularly interested in that yet, but she really is fascinated by mummies and sarcophagi and hieroglyphics. So yeah, it is interesting. But for me, I think I remember finding the sort of sensationalism of the Tudors very intriguing, and Henry VIII and his wives, and the macabre of the whole thing. And I was actually fascinated. One of my very early memories was my dad taking me to Fotheringhay Castle, and I used to always ask to go to Fotheringhay Castle, which, like, for those who haven't been there, it's literally a hill, and it's literally a hill, a river running past it, and a lot of sheep poo. But I was fascinated with trying to reconstruct this castle in my mind, and the medieval came to me. I think the Victorians have a lot to answer for in relation to how we think about the Middle Ages, because they like to glamorize it, think of the Pre-Raphaelites and the depictions of myth and legend with the Lady of Shalott or Mariana, and they loved sort of depicting medieval dress, and I think I thought that it was quite magical. And one of my favorite Disney films was Sleeping Beauty, which is set in the 14th century. And I think it was the sort of the mythology of it and the beauty of it and this sort of fairy tale nature of the Middle Ages that when I was very young inspired me. But then I later on came to it, I think, through medieval art. I studied the Anglo-Saxons when I did my undergrad. And then I went on to write my thesis, my research master's thesis on John of Gaunt's Savoy Palace, because I was really interested in how important the Savoy was in London, his palace as a construct, and after the Peasants' Revolt, why he never rebuilt it, which kind of led me to John of Gaunt and led me to his character and everything that happened in his life and that particular period of around 1381. So I think I'd say for the last sort of 15 years, I've been working on the Peasants' Revolt, and what happened in June 1381. And so I know the ins and outs of that fairly well, because I covered it both academically and twice in two different books. But yes, I think now for me, it's the culture of the Middle Ages. It's obviously the intrigue of the characters and the kings and the queens and the people. But I try in this book to bring together everything that's always inspired me in relation to the material culture, the art, the literature, what it sort of felt like in that period, what people experienced and how they then projected it outwards thereafter.
Yeah, to pick up on what you said there about the way we're taught history, it's funny, isn't it? Because I think people assume, and when I say that, I mean people outside of the UK, think that as Brits, we must just learn about all British history. But actually, it kind of is the Egyptians, the Tudors, maybe a bit of 1066, a bit. World War One and World War Two when you're doing your GCSEs, and that's pretty much it. Like the Plantagenets, the Hanoverians, the Georgians, the Victorians, nary a look
Yeah,
in.
no, no, no. It's like the Georgians, and you sort of look blankly, and you're like Jane Austen. But I think children like gore. They like you know. My core memories of learning about the ancient Egyptians and finding it fascinating was this idea that they were embalmed. And
Yeah,
the idea that they took
brain
the
out through
brain
the
out,
nose.
I was about to say brain out the nose as they cook. We've all learned that fact. And again, I think the part of the reason why children are so fascinated with Henry VIII is the fact that it's this sort of it's quite tantalizing, but children are trying to wrap their heads around this quite graphic, quite horrific thing to do. But it's almost, it's made into sort of song and dance and verse, and it becomes part of the fabric of their like cultural knowledge. It's a huge part of learning at that age. I think sometimes it's the dark and the nasty and the gritty of the things that children seem to remember because they can't separate something that is actually there's a safety in it being in the past. There's about it being quite shocking. And I think to an extent, I think I do have a problem with that, partly because it is often at the expense of women that a lot of these stories continue to pervade, and actually young girls who are particularly interested in all of that aren't necessarily, that's not for me the right messaging that's coming to them.
Did you go to the Medieval Women exhibition that was on a few months ago?
I did. I went twice.
Same.
Yeah. No, I loved it. I loved it. Yeah. Yeah.
So good, so good. I was just bowled over by the artifacts and the stories, in particular the story of,
Yeah.
forgive me, what was she? The story of effectively a 13th century trans woman.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Eleanor Reichner.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So Eleanor Wagner was in my book, but for my editor for space, Eleanor was sadly removed. I think it's also because I was perhaps crowbarring Eleanor into the story. But yeah, Eleanor Ryken is really interesting, and actually the material that is available, the record of her in the record, like it's fascinating, and you can read all of the original. I think it was she came in. It was like court record. I think she was taken. It's King's Bench, I think, that she appears in. So yeah, it's fascinating, and there's lots of there's lots of these brilliant characters that pop out in the record, and I think that's part of what I enjoy being a narrative historian is I'm not bound in the same way as I am with my academic work. I'm not bound by sort of empirical evidence. I am able to find character and humanity and anecdotes and put them in to tell a story and to create a sense of what this world was like.
So a couple of more fanciful questions for you now. If you could jump in a time travel machine and witness a single moment from history, do you have one?
I like the phrasing of that because often people say, could you go back and be in it? And I was always like, no, because it's all pretty awful. What would I witness? I think it's something like the spectacle, I think would be fascinating to see what the people were, if we're talking about court circles, were very good at was entertainment and spectacle. And I think there was a very fine line between what was fictional and play and what was reality, especially in some of these court circles. And I think that would have been such a sort of heady, hedonistic environment to observe. I'm thinking about tournaments and jousts and some of the feasts that would happen around that. I think like quite extraordinary.
Yeah, that's not a million miles actually from what Helen Carr said,
Oh,
funnily
yeah,
enough.
did she?
She
Yeah.
said that rather than going back to a specific moment, that instead she'd prefer to go back and just witness a day at the court in the 14th century. And I see something in that. It would
Yeah.
be fascinating to see how these people walked, in the clothes they were wearing. How did they talk? How did they actually sound? Because we can make educated guesses, but we can't be
No.
certain actually how they pronounced certain words and things like that. I think it would be fascinating.
Yeah, I'd love to get a sense of dialect or a sense of, yeah, the sort of phonetic nature of how it all kind of yeah, the vernacular, like how it all kind of played out.
I'm sure this is going to be a very difficult question to answer, but if you could meet one person featured in your book and ask them a single question, who and what would it be?
I think I kind of have to say John of Gaunt because I've written a book about him as well, and he's in Sceptred Isle. And that might sound predictable, but I think that John of Gaunt was a very astute and experienced individual, and I'd sort of like to meet him at the end of his life. And I would like to, I don't know what I would like to ask him. What went wrong? I don't know, because I think I would just like to just I think I'd just like to sit down with him and just see how he conducted himself. And I would like to understand from him that shift from this world that was imbued with chivalry and military prowess and how that transitioned into something that was far more, I would say, Anglo-centric and aesthetic from a more Ricardian sort of perspective, and how he felt that that shift of power happened, and shift of power, I say shift of power, shift of sort of cultural interest.
So, as I said at the start, we're here to talk about your latest book, Sceptred Isle, A New History of the 14th Century. Today we're going to be covering effectively the reign of Edward II. You start the book with the death of Edward I, so Edward II's father, and then you go right through to the deposition of Richard II. You open by briefly exploring the window in which King Edward I's reign, he is attempting to fully establish dominance over Scotland. So how had the English king come to have such power north of Hadrian's Wall? I mean, he's effectively brought in to mediate over who should be the King of Scotland, right?
So initially, Edward I was drawn in as an arbitrator because Scotland was facing a succession crisis. So after the death of Alexander III, who died in 1286, I'm like getting my dates, 1286, he died without an heir. And his heir was Margaret, the Maid of Norway. So she was she was his granddaughter, but she was over in Norway. And when she was traveling over to Norway to become a young queen and a potential prospective bride for the future Edward II, she died en route, I think around Orkney area. And yeah, she was really young, and she died, and Scotland was faced with no natural ruler. And there were two sort of major factions, noble factions. There was the Bruce faction and the Balliol faction. And if it wasn't for an arbitrator, a powerful arbitrator, Scotland would have probably plunged into some kind of civil war between these two factions. And this was between John Balliol and Robert Bruce. And Robert Bruce was this not the same Robert Bruce that we encounter later on. It was his grandfather. And so Edward comes in to arbitrate, and he realizes that Balliol is going to be effectively his puppet. So he chooses Balliol, and he says, "Right, I've made my decision. Balliol is your new king." And then he goes back off again. And at this point, Edward is like an unspoken sort of superior figure in the British Isles, because he is the overlord of of Wales. He installs his son as Prince of Wales, the first English Prince of Wales. And Ireland is already nominally colonized by the English, so he is sort of counts himself as king of these realms too. But Scotland has always had its own separate king, and up until this point, things had been pretty okay between them. There'd been intermarriage. There'd been there'd been a lot of diplomacy. It was a reasonably secure allegiance between these two countries. But then what Balliol does is he starts to feel frustrated with Edward's grip over him, he feels like he doesn't have the agency that he might like as King of Scotland, and so he makes the catastrophic mistake of reigniting what's called the Old Alliance, which is AULD, Old Alliance with the French, who are England's age-old enemy, who are having all sorts of disputes with Edward I over Gascony, which is this pocket of land inside Aquitaine, and which is in sort of southwest France. It's a huge portion of land encompassing really important cities like Bordeaux. And when Edward finds out, he is absolutely furious, like steaming with rage. And he says, right, I'm attacking Scotland. He's like, right, that's it. I'm going to conquer Scotland like I did Wales. And so initially he's reasonably successful. He goes up to Scotland. He captures Balliol. He has him publicly humiliated. He's stripped of his, he has a special a costume like made for him, that he's forced to wear. And then there's a ceremony where he's stripped of his tabard, and he's then known as tomb tabard, which is sort of without his arms. And it's a public humiliation. And then Balliol is shipped back down to England, where he's kept as prisoner. And Edward then says, right, I am now ruling Scotland, and that it stays like that for a period of time until you get popular uprisings, the most famous being with William Wallace. And then Wallace is captured and executed. And so the war from Scotland starts in 1296, and it goes on and on until, well, it sort of goes on and on and on. When is the end? But this is the first phase of the England-Scotland Wars of Independence, the Anglo-Scottish Wars of Independence, or the Scottish Wars of Independence. And Edward I is formidable. He is a formidable king, but he's so angry. He gets very sort of personally. He feels personally attacked when the Scots kind of go and make this allegiance with the French, and so his attack on Scotland is phenomenally punitive. He takes the stone of Scone from Scone, which is the traditional coronation stone, and he has it shipped back down to England and deliberately encased in the coronation chair that he has purpose built to cover the stone of Scone. So, I mean, he's making a serious political statement. He moves his entire administrative centre up to York. I mean, he is saying he's taking Scotland and there's no way out.
Yeah, he comes across as a man who really enjoyed turning the screw, almost in a petty, spiteful way. He knew how to be particularly cruel. And on that subject, I was so shocked to read the story of Isabella of Buchan, a woman I hadn't heard of before.
Yeah, I know.
But crazy story. So what did Edward I do to her, and why?
Yeah. So Edward encounters opposition with the likes of Wallace, but the only sort of really major figure that he encounters that puts up extraordinary defence against him in Scotland is Robert Bruce. And Bruce was originally, he's a member of the Scottish nobility. He has fought for the English at this point. It's very blurred. I mean, something I think that's really important to make clear about the wars between England and Scotland was this wasn't a war of nations. It was a political war. So you had Englishmen fighting for the Scots and you had Scotsmen fighting for the English, because it was more of an allegiance to where you held land. What are your personal assets that you're protecting? Bruce did have land in England. He fought for Edward. He fought for Edward before. He had previously been on the side of the English king, and then he had later on, without going into too much detail about this, because you can go on and on and on. He decided enough was enough. He had a very public dispute with another member of the Scottish nobility over the future of Scotland and the Scottish crown, and he ended up having himself crowned at Scone. And even though the stone of Scone wasn't there, he went to Scone and he went through that ceremony and he said, "I am now." He publicly proclaimed himself, "I am now King of Scotland." And Isabella, Countess of Buchan, was actually married to a loyalist to Edward I, but she was a member of the Clan Macduff family, and the Macduffs were traditionally the clan members would place the crown on the Scottish king's head. So Isabella was the one to do that. And what happened was Bruce was initially putting up this resistance, but then he had Edward started to overpower him. He had to escape. He had to flee, but he left many members of his family behind at Kildrummy Castle, and his wife is Elizabeth de Burgh, his daughter Marjorie, his sister Margaret, and Isabella, Countess of Buchan, were all captured. And to prove a point, Edward the First had these women, well, Isabella and Margaret, Bruce's sister, certainly, he had them imprisoned in cages. So Isabella was imprisoned in a cage at Berwick Castle, and Margaret was imprisoned. She was imprisoned elsewhere, but her cage was slightly different to Isabella's. So I love that this, we're talking about the specifics of these cages. And Edward wanted Isabella's cage, and it's in the record that it's written out like this, that he wanted her to be imprisoned within iron confines in the shape of a crown, and it was to be suspended from the walls of Berwick Castle. And there is one Chronicle source that talks about what happened, and she was basically, according to this source, put inside this cage, and she was hung from the side of the castle at a great height. And she remained there for a long period of time. I think she was there for about 7 years, probably coming in and out of it. But she didn't live long after she was freed, which does demonstrate the trauma and the physical duress that she was put under, being in those conditions.
Okay. So she's hanging in a cage on the side of a castle for 7 years, effectively.
I expect that there was some interim, but yes.
But surely exposure would have got her. That's the bit I'm a bit confused
Yeah,
with.
I think it was probably that she was imprisoned, but I expect that there were periods where she was in it and there were periods where she was not, because there's no way she would have survived the elements or starvation for that long. So, yeah, she was, but that is as far as the record, that's as far as we know. We know that the cages were made. We know that hers was allegedly suspended from Berwick, and we know that I want to say she was imprisoned at Carlisle Castle, but I'd have to reread and remind myself. But her cage was built into the wall, so it was slightly different. Yeah, I know, it's a bit better. She had a better cage, but yeah, I mean, the treatment of women from Edward the First was atrocious, and the Bruce women were suffered greatly from under his wrath. And I think, this is a period where women weren't executed, but they were certainly punished.
So in 1307, Edward I dies in the arms of a servant who, when lifting him up, he physically died in the servant's arms.
Yeah.
He is succeeded by his son, another Edward II. Now, history is littered with royal sons who struggle to escape the shadow of a more domineering father. And from your writing, it seems that the nobles of England viewed the new Edward II as a very different man from his father right from the start of the reign. So how so? What were the things about these men that were so different in their respective characters?
I think the idea of kingship and what it meant to be a successful king in the Middle Ages was a challenging role for many people to step into. And I think this is where a lot of it comes down to character and natural leadership skills and the ability to step into a role with awareness, self-awareness, and awareness of what that role entails. And I think where some monarchs maybe had that sort of skill in buckets, Edward II certainly didn't. I think with a father like Edward I, who I think was a bully, and without having brothers of his age, he had two much younger half brothers later on, but without having a sort of cohort of siblings, male siblings, there was a lot of pressure on Edward, and he didn't have those sorts of fraternal bonds that I think were very important to young men, and still are important to men in this period. And one of the things, his father knew that, and one of the things he did is he installed in his household young men, young fighting men, in order for them to teach his son how to fight, how to be a soldier, how to be a man. And one of the men that he chose for Edward is to be a member of his household was a proven soldier, was a Gascon squire called Piers Gaveston. And Gaveston is a good example of Edward II's desire and need to be supported, to feel like he has someone on his side, to feel like somebody is there telling him that he's making the right decisions or helping him make the decisions in the first place. I think that Edward gives a lot of his power away, which causes major problems for the rest of the nobility going forward during his reign. He he was a very easily manipulated individual right from a very young age.
To talk about Piers Gaveston, I think what becomes clear very quickly about Edward's reign was that he had an over-reliance on favourites. Chief among them, certainly at the start of the reign, is Piers Gaveston. So why was Piers, in particular, so problematic for many of the old, established nobility?
I think age-old snobbery, for a start. I mean, it's interesting because Edward's first act as king is to promote Piers Gaveston, who is in exile at this point, by the way, when his father dies, because Edward I has sent him there because he is, well, it's unsure. Some people say, oh, it's because he was having a relationship with Edward II. I don't think it was that. I think Gaveston and Edward had got up to no good together in more of a kind of jovial, jocular, laddish way. They'd broken into the deer park of the Chancellor or something and done just boys being boys. And I think it was also that he resented Gaveston's. I think he could see that his son was giving too much away to Gaveston. He asked him to give him the county of Poitiers in Aquitaine, and Edward was like, hey, how dare you think you can just give land away like this? Like, who are you? You haven't earned any land. Like, think again, son.
He calls him a bastard son of a bitch, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's you son of a bitch. Yeah, you bastard, exactly that. You bastard son of a bitch, verbatim. And to punish him, he dispatches Gaveston into exile. And Edward's first mission when on his kingship after his father dies is to recall Gaveston, and even from the north of England where his father had died, he promotes Gaveston to Earl of Cornwall. I mean, Earl of Cornwall is a title that not only is an extraordinary and wealthy and prestigious pocket of land. Cornwall is producing a lot of important metals like tin in this period, and he is promoted to the same level as someone like the Earl of Lancaster, who is a royal prince. And Gaveston's this squire. But interestingly, Lancaster and some of the major members of the nobility who later have a real problem with Gaveston sign that charter. They are in agreement to Gaveston's promotion. And that's interesting as to why that's the case. So it's not, at this stage, even early on, about Gaveston's lowly status. It's not even about Edward and Gaveston being friends. I think the problem that comes later on is that Edward is unable to rule effectively without Gaveston. They see Gaveston as driving a wedge between the accepted hierarchy of king and his nobility serve the king, and it's this sort of partnership that's created, and they all kind of and the king listens to his counsel from his elite members, but he stops doing that because he's got Gaveston to listen to the counsel of, and so they make the ill-fated decision to get rid of Gaveston, and they have eventually, after a lot of push-pull, a lot of almost civil war breaking out, they capture Gaveston and they execute him after a show trial. I mean, and it is the moment, I think, where feuding amongst the nobility becomes Machiavellian, and it becomes murderous, and it becomes very bloody. And there is a period then from in the early part of the 14th century where it is I use the symbol of the Wheel of Fortune in the book, and then there is a constant spinning of this Wheel of Fortune, and it is a case of certain factions of the nobility are at the top, heralding their success, and the next minute they are on the scaffold themselves, and it becomes a real case of a lot of literal backstabbing. And so they execute Gaveston, and the problem was that That doesn't solve the problem of Edward's inherent insecurity and his inherent need to have these very close male bonds.
Yeah, and on the subject of their bond, there has been a long held belief that they did develop a homosexual relationship. Despite there actually being a lack of contemporary evidence, it's sort of circumstantial evidence, I suppose. I mean, I think what a lot of people miss, for example, is that both Edward and Gaveston have illegitimate children outside of their respective marriages. You put forward a suggestion, a fascinating suggestion, that they started out as very good friends and then it progressed into a form of ritual brotherhood rather than something sexual. Now, it could have been sexual, we just can't say for certain, but you do put forward this theory around ritual brotherhood. So what was that and how does it apply to their story?
So I think that we have to think about what male relationships could look like in this period. You see often, and even in certain communities now, particularly in sort of Eastern countries, places like India, often see a real closeness between men in environments where women are circumnavigated, where relationships and closeness with women isn't necessarily out of choice. It's often arranged or it's political. So if you're in the Middle Ages, a lot of marriages and relationships between the nobility were arranged and they were acts of politics rather than love matches. And in that, you have a closeness between men. You get that sort of romantic, loving connection with your friends, with other men. So you see, bromance. You see, in places now, you often see men holding hands. If you travel over, I'm thinking I've traveled through India, and I would often see young men walking together, very, very affectionate with each other and holding hands. And that doesn't mean that's homosexual. It's just a male closeness that feels obscure to our Western modern lens. And I think that with Edward and Gaveston, I think you have to go with what is written in the record. And according to the record, Edward repeatedly refers to Gaveston as his brother. And I think that their relationship was obscure even by their contemporary standards. That's why the chroniclers were interested in it. But I carefully use the term queer in relation to Edward and Gaveston, in the way that what they were experiencing together was queer through the eyes of the people who were looking at it. They were saying, this is different. This isn't a sort of heterosexual relationship that's playing out here. This isn't a traditional male friendship even that's necessarily playing out here. So I use queer rather than homosexual. And ritual brotherhood makes a lot of sense because a lot of the literature and the culture that figures like Piers Gaveston and Edward were imbibing and reading, and probably reading to each other, included stories like Lancelot and Galahad, which is a clear, loving relationship between two men, to the point where Galahad is so distressed through his love for Lancelot. I can't remember who dies first, Lancelot or Galahad, but they end up being buried together. And there is examples of medieval knights found buried together, and ritual brotherhood was akin to a marriage. There was often even a ceremony with the binding of two men together, and it was considered to be quite like soldierly. It was meant to reflect sort of a brothers in arms type relationship. You are men who fight together, die together, and you also have biblical references. So there's Jonathan and David, who are close in the Bible, and there's often references to them in relation to male to male relations throughout history. And these are the sorts of stories that Edward and Gaveston would have been aware of. And I think they had some kind of ritual brotherhood and closeness. Saying that, there's also a very convincing school of thought that says, well, there's less evidence to say that Isabella and Mortimer were having sex. So why are we not saying that? Why do we need more to say that Edward and Gaveston weren't? And also, it's perfectly reasonable that they might sleep with women as well and father children as well as sleeping with each other. So the fact is, we just can't know. But for me, the only thing that I'm a historian work from what it says, and it says that he refers to him as brother, and I think that's how he considered Gaveston. I think he considered him as a brother, but I think their physical relationship was 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 queer in that it was far more tender than was even normal in this period, but I'm not sure that that would equate to sexual.
Yeah, I am inclined to agree with you. The thing that throws me slightly still is the arms that are displayed at the coronation feast. It's a bit weird, isn't it, that the Queen's are not
Yeah,
displayed.
yeah,
I
yeah,
think it infuriates her uncles. But Gaveston's are. It's so
yeah,
personal. It's almost like Edward saying, this is my actual
yeah.
partner, this is my husband. That's why his arms are displayed alongside mine and the Queen's aren't. It's pretty unusual, isn't it?
It's unusual, but it's not the first time that happens. You see Edward and Gaveston's arms together on the document that is his earldom of Cornwall, but that's also with the de Clare arms as well, because Gaveston is he's married to Margaret de Clare, and you see Edward's arm, the arms of Edward in the middle, and then you have Gaveston's on one side and Margaret's on the other, and then there's a sort of it's like a spread eagle who with the wings kind of coming over the two arms, and it's almost like saying, "This is my family." I think he's saying Gaveston is his family in that rather than his partner. I think he probably considered Gaveston as a type of partner, but it's very tempting to apply our modern idea and our modern contemporary emotion on, or our idea of sexuality and emotions onto people in this period. And it's so hard to separate from that. And so I think also it's one of those things we have to sort of accept. We're just not going to know. And
Oh, well, until someone develops that time travel machine, we're just not going to
yeah,
know.
exactly. We're just not going to know. And I think my belief is that it is this ritual. It's a ritual brotherhood. It's a male closeness that just doesn't really reflect like today's sorts of types of male closeness that we see between people we know every day now. So it feels obscure. It feels like we have to name it. And actually, I just don't think that's necessarily possible.
So Edward's reign goes south pretty quickly. A series of rules are brought in. They're known as the Ordinances, and they're set up to try and control the king and thus the
Yeah.
kingdom. So were the Ordinances in effect Magna Carta 2.0?
I think anything that's sort of legislative after Magna Carta was a bit of was influenced by Magna Carta. I think kings lived under the spectre of Magna Carta for a very long time, and Magna Carta is often referenced and was often referenced and reissued and reissued and reissued. And the ordinances have a sort of Magna Carta feel about them, but they're far more specific. So when you look at the ordinances, I mean, Piers Gaveston is named in the ordinances, and you wouldn't get something quite that specific in Magna Carta. It's very relational to Edward's reign. And interestingly, the ordinances are brought up later on in Richard's reign as well. It's almost like we could do this again, to kings who just won't listen to the council of their nobility.
Well, that's quite a loaded threat, really, isn't it? It's a way of saying to Richard II, remember what happened before.
Yeah, it is. And the thing is with the ordinances and Magna Carta, I think that if the king is, I mean, Magna Carta was obviously clearly a very useful document, but there was always going to be there's always needed to be a way of controlling a king who didn't want to be controlled, and bureaucracy was the natural way to do that because the only other option is war.
So it's because of Gaveston flouting the ordinances that he's eventually killed, right? I mean, that's what leads to his death.
Yeah, that's kind of what they get him on. Yeah.
Okay, so in 1314, Edward loses a crucial battle against Robert the Bruce in Scotland, the Battle of Bannockburn. This leads to widespread famine. So how did that come about? And what impact does it have on Edward's reign? I mean, it sounds a bit like Queen Mary I 200 years later. Was he just very unlucky in certain respects?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So you have Bannockburn that's kind of happening in tandem with this famine, which starts to emerge around 1314, and it goes on, and it's sort of at its peak in the 1315, 16, 17. And you've got, it's interesting, you've got sort of like two things happening kind of in parallel at the same time. You've got the general populace dealing with the fact they've got no food, and then you've got Edward who's dealing with all of the political problems in his court, in his government, his increasing falling out and resentment to his cousin, the Earl of Lancaster, who, I mean, may as well have swung the axe that beheaded Piers Gaveston. And Bannockburn was a canonical military failure in the Middle Ages, partly because of this appalling rift in between Edward and his nobility. There was no cohesion between them, and that is a problem when you're trying to arrange a large army, when you're trying to get them to do what you need them to do on the battlefield. There has to feel a sense of cohesion, and it's such an important part of morale is so important. So the chronicles kind of dip between like, oh yeah, there's a famine going on. And then there's also, but then let's go back to the court. Let's go back to Edward and Lancaster. But I mean, to start first with the famine, it was a result of just an appalling, it was luck. Yes, for Edward, it was luck. The government didn't seem to do a huge amount about it. They did cap the prices of food to stop them inflating too much. But it was the consequence of a series of years of terrible weather, and that people just could not bring in the harvest. I mean, they couldn't grow a crop. It was just too wet. The ground was too wet, and this is a time when people relied on their entire infrastructure relied on what the environment could provide. It relied on the cyclical nature of the harvest, and when that isn't when it's not bearing any fruits, it becomes a real problem. But did it impact the nobility? Not as much. I think there's one incident in the record where Edward goes to find food in a monastery and finds that they don't have any bread, and so is like, oh, well, they've got no bread because there's a famine going on. So it impacts the general populace massively, but less so Edward, who's just focused on this rift that he's got going on with the Scots and with Robert Bruce. And he's trying, Bruce is becoming more and more successful. He's taking more after the death of his father, of Edward I. Bruce is just managing to take more and more castles back. He's becoming increasingly powerful, and he's moving towards Stirling Castle. And the problem if he takes Stirling, Edward loses control of the Highlands. He loses all access to the most important parts of Scotland. He's only got control at this point over the border, and then it only takes Bruce pushing further down. And also, what's important at this point to know is Bruce is conducting a series of raids across the border. He's annexing, by raiding people in these border communities, Edward is unable to defend. He is effectively annexing the northern border from the rest of the country, and he's demanding tribute payments. And Bruce made something crazy, like millions on tribute payments from the north, because people weren't being protected by Edward because he didn't have the men or the resources to do it, and particularly after Bannockburn. And the people said, fine, well, we'll pay you not to attack us. And that was how Bruce managed to create a lot of income and become as powerful and successful as he did. So Bannockburn was really, the battle took place to try and liberate Stirling Castle from being taken by Bruce. And it was what I think we'd say now an epic failure.
So Gaveston is dead, new favourites appear on the scene, and they are the Despensers. So who were the Despensers, and why did they become effectively despised very quickly?
Yeah, so the Despensers are two helpfully/unhelpfully named Hughs. So there is Hugh Despenser the elder and Hugh Despenser the younger, which I have to admit, in writing this book, got very boring typing out.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Everyone had the same bloody name. You've got hundreds of Margarets, hundreds of Edwards, hundreds of Henrys. It's a pain in the bum when you're writing.
Oh, it is. It's really annoying. And so I just, eventually I did sort of expect the reader to know who I was referring to at a certain point. Because I just thought Despenser, I have to just say Despenser, I can't do this anymore. So the Despensers were a old noble family. Hugh Despenser the Elder was a veteran of Edward I's wars, and he was a member of the nobility. He was close to Edward I. He had proven himself as a loyal soldier, and he sort of risen up the ranks. And his son Hugh had a role in Edward's coronation. So he was, yeah, he was one of the sort of members of the noble houses who surrounded the king at Westminster. And Hugh Despenser the Younger, managed to gain a position in Edward's household as his chamberlain. And as his chamberlain, he got spent a lot of time with the king, and he got to speak to him one to one. It was sort of very kind of close companionship. And that is how they became close. And you start to see Despenser as one of a handful of young men, young nobles who start to kind of cluster around Edward after Gaveston's death. So Despenser starts to really sort of rise to prominence from around 1318, so maybe a little before, but around this period you start to see him popping up in the record a lot more in relation to spending time with Edward. And he's around other favourites like Roger Damery, Hugh Audley, and it's interesting that Despenser is also in this. People often think that Despenser was married to one of the de Clare sisters after with Edward's order, but actually he married her much earlier. He was married to Eleanor de Clare. So Eleanor de Clare is one of the nieces of Edward the Second. She's his favourite niece. You see him gifting her quite a lot from his wardrobe accounts. And he spends a lot of time with Eleanor and Despenser. There's a sort of little unit of three. It's a little trio. And the other de Clare sisters are married also to Edward's current favourites. So they're married to Roger Damery. Elizabeth de Clare is married to Roger Damery, and Margaret is married to Hugh Audley. So that's Piers Gaveston's widow now. And so Despenser becomes a problem through his avarice, through his greed, and the real issue comes through these three sisters, the de Clare sisters. And the de Clare sisters are the sisters of Gilbert de Clare, who was killed. He was one of the members of the nobility killed at the Battle of Bannockburn, leaving no heir to inherit a vast portion of land across the Welsh March. This is extraordinary wealth. These are sort of royals, and Edward Edward starts agreeing to Despenser being married to one of these sisters. He finds a way to effectively take the land from the other sisters, and by a series of illegal exchanges. And Edward endorses the whole thing. And the nobility are like, especially on the Welsh March, the Mortimers, how the hell do you think you're doing this? He's becoming way too powerful in this region. And this culminates in the Welsh Marcher barons allying themselves with Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. This is when the Civil War starts, because you have Edward, the royals, you have the royalist faction, and Despenser against these powerful Welsh baronial families and Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. And it is a bit touch and go for a while, but then Lancaster retreats north and is captured at the Battle of Boroughbridge by Andrew Harclay, who is actually a very esteemed and battle-hardened soldier who's under Edward's orders, who's coming down from the northern border, and he intercepts the Earl of Lancaster and takes him prisoner. And Thomas Earl of Lancaster is given a pretty similar show trial as he gave Piers Gaveston, and I think Edward was very happy to. I think he was very relieved to have Thomas Earl of Lancaster dispatched in the same way as he had his dear friend.
Yeah, he eventually got his revenge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Duchy of Gascony, you very briefly mentioned it earlier. It's within the lands known as Aquitaine. It becomes something of a thorn in the side for Edward II. So what is it that leads to the war that explodes between Edward and the French crown over these lands?
So there's always been sort of political strife in relation to Gascony, because effectively no English king wanted to pay homage to the French king for land that he held in Gascony. It was never a thought that an English king relished having to go and bend the knee to his superior French cousin. And Edward's wife, Isabella of France, now her brother, on the throne is Charles IV. He is a astute king. He's not going to let Edward get away with. He's not going to let Edward get away with not coming over and paying homage for his lands. And so basically there's a skirmish on the border between Gascony and the rest of France, and it causes friction. And then Edward is expected to go over and pay homage, and he keeps refusing to do so. And it results in a significant amount of tension and talk of war. And Isabella is sent over to France as a diplomat. She's effectively goes over to try to convince her brother to sort of give Edward a chance, let him kind of come to do his duty in his time. She's trying to find a way of bringing the two sides back together again and come to it. She's an arbitrator, which is a traditional role for a queen as well. It's not like she's doing this. It's not like she's the first queen to have to do this. Interceding, it was a very normal part of queenship. So she tries to get involved, but Isabella is also being treated appallingly back at home in England before this, and she's a French queen. Therefore, there's a lot of antagonism towards her because of the fact that she is French. Edward removes all of the French members of her household purely for being French. There's a lot of this sort of really anti-French rhetoric that starts being spread around this period. And because they're saying that, they're not to be trusted, the French king's not to be trusted, so Isabella's not to be trusted. So she has her lands of Cornwall removed. And this, I think, was a direct idea of Hugh Despenser, again, to gain more property and land for himself. I mean, even the Queen of England is not immune to his avarice, which is extraordinary. It's an extraordinary thought. But Isabella goes to France, and she realizes there, especially when her young son Edward, the future Edward III, joins her, because his father stupidly lets him be the one to go over rather than himself to pay homage to the French king. But he doesn't see that he's also playing into Isabella's hands. Edward goes over, he goes back to his mother, and she then holds the future king of England in her possession. And a woman who has an heir, especially a future king, is a very powerful figure indeed. And she refuses to come back. And she names why she's not coming back. And Hugh Despenser is the reason why she's not coming back. She calls him a Pharisee, and she makes it very clear that she is deeply afraid of him. He is a dangerous individual, and he will stop at nothing to get what he wants. And so she refuses to come back to England whilst he is still in the company of her husband.
Yeah, I mean, that was such a colossal mistake from Edward, wasn't it? To allow his son, the prince, the heir apparent, to leave England's shores.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, Isabella is an incredibly powerful figure in Europe in her own right. With her son by her side, she's even more powerful. She refuses to come back, and she begins to have a relationship with a man called Roger Mortimer. Now, surely if she's sleeping with Mortimer, that is a statement. She is sending a message out there, my marriage is over, effectively. If she's willing to allow a sexual relationship with Mortimer to be openly acknowledged and talked about.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. And I think this is where close reading of sources and considering situations is important. So Isabella is very clever in her methods with this. We know that they were probably in a sexual relationship, but that's not from Isabella's direct words. It is from Edward's, because he says she keeps company with him in and out of the house, which the house effectively in and out of the personal space. The sharing a bed is the implication of that message. And Isabella, I think you're right. Isabella considers her marriage to be over because of the intervention of Hugh Despenser, who's come between. She says, somebody has come between myself and my husband. But what she cleverly does is uses fashion, which is something she's very good at, to her advantage here. And she starts to wear black. She starts to wear widow's weeds, the robes of mourning. So she's saying she's mourning her marriage. She's mourning the loss of her husband. And that's a very good political device. Fashion and clothing is a good political device. It's soft power. It's a way that women are able to convey their messaging, and she does that very well. Yeah, and people did pick up on it, and it evokes empathy for her, which is also what I think her plan was, that people would feel for her. They'd feel sorry for her. But also, interestingly, one would think that she would be the one considered in the wrong for having an affair with Roger Mortimer, whereas by medieval standards, often it was the case, not all the time, but often it was the case that the husband was punished for the adultery of the wife because the wife was seen as the weaker minded one. She was the one that, he was supposed to be the one to keep her in check. He was supposed to be the one to keep her faithful and loyal, and he had failed in that husbandly duty. And so, yeah, I think that her relationship with Mortimer, her being clear about it, was another stab at Edward, saying he's failed at his role as a husband. He's failed at that duty.
So while they're in Paris, Isabella also pulls off a blinder and arranges a marriage for her son Edward to Philippa of Hainaut. So how did that marriage bolster Isabella's position for effectively taking on her husband and the hated Despensers?
Well, she gets an army. So she gets men. She gets men to fight her cause, and she gets the support of the Count of Hainaut. So it's win-win for Isabella, and she's able to create an alliance independently away from her husband. But yeah, importantly, she gets men. She gets men to lead back to England, and she has her own army to counter the kings in England when she makes that journey.
So an invasion of England is now fully planned. How was Edward reacting to this back in England, and to whom were the English effectively loyal?
So it's funny, I don't think Edward really knew. I think he was panicking because he didn't know what was happening. And I don't think he was expecting Isabella to come with troops from Hainaut. I think he was looking over at the French king. He was worrying about the French sending an army, not Isabella. And so I think it's quite a shock to him when it's her that comes with an army. I mean, he knew that she was with Roger Mortimer and they were sort of hatching plans. He was terrified of Mortimer. He kept talking about Mortimer, sort of how he was a villain and making all these proclamations about the French and Mortimer and defending the coastline. But I don't think he thought that the French actually wouldn't be part of Isabella's army. I think that's what he very much anticipated, but it didn't manifest that way. And in England, I mean, Despenser was phenomenally unpopular. And while Isabella was in France, and really after the Battle of Boroughbridge, you see Edward sort of sink into this very suspicious, paranoid, calculating or cold individual, which is very different to the Edward that you see, the sort of jovial, quite loving, quite kind, generous, affable man when he's spending time with somebody like Piers Gaveston. And I think that by the end of his reign, I think he is increasingly unpopular because of his paranoia. And when people in power become paranoid, they become dangerous. And the same was happening with Despenser, and there was a lot of there was a lot of sort of rash behavior, drastic actions taking place, and people were increasingly observing that, and they hated Despenser. All the nobility hated Despenser. Everyone wanted him gone. And when Isabella arrived on the shore, what's important is that she's not there to oust Edward. She's there to oust Despenser. So people opened her with open arms. They were like, "Come on!" Edward's half brothers, Edmund, Earl of Kent, was there he was rallying support for her. He was in support of her mission, and when she went to London, she got an extraordinary amount of support for her cause. And I don't think Despenser really had a chance at this point.
Yes, well, it's at this point that Edward's personal rule entirely collapses. Isabella and Mortimer oversee the very grisly execution of the Despensers, particularly Despenser the Younger. He is hung, drawn and quartered, I think like 30 feet high on a ladder. It's very graphic. But Edward is still technically king. So at this point, was reconciliation with Isabella, had that now become an impossibility?
Yes. Yes, it had, because what was the problem? The problem was it was them or him at this point. Because if he was returned to the throne, if he was enabled to rule as king again, what's his first action going to be? He's going to execute Mortimer. They're not going to let that happen. So he is forced to abdicate in favor of his son, which he does, and then he's put under house arrest. And there are a couple of plots to liberate him from Kenilworth Castle, and one of them is half successful before it's stopped and he's brought back again. And then he's moved to Berkeley Castle, which is a much smaller, very bucolic, sort of fortified, crenellated castle in Gloucestershire. And it's there that he's murdered. And I think that he was murdered under the orders of Roger Mortimer, because there's an understanding, as there was an understanding by leaders and kings thereafter, you can't have two kings ruling at the same time because that's just going to cause civil war. Somebody has to go.
Yes, so with the abdication, there are, I suppose, two schools of belief. One, that Edward willingly accepted it and signed the abdication happily, and then there's the no, his hand was very much forced and he was devastated at what had happened. Where do you sit on this?
Yeah, I think he was forced. I think he was forced to do it. Yeah. I don't think he would have done that because I think it's the beginning of the end by abdicating your position.
Yes, and what do we know about how he was coping? He's transferred over to Berkeley Castle, as you said. Ostensibly, well, he's a prisoner, but he still has a household. He's given good food, good wine. But do we know how he was physically coping with the change in his position?
We don't really know. I mean, you're right, he was treated like he wasn't treated like a prisoner. He was treated well. He was given money, he was given everything he wanted, all the trappings of kingship and the luxuries that he was used to, albeit in sort of a smaller, more restricted space. There is a poem called The Lament of Edward II, which is this very sort of gushing, very sad and affecting piece of literature, contemporary piece of literature, which is all about his sadness over the whole event and actually how much he loves Isabella and how he's so devastated to lose her. But I mean, that wasn't from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So it's very difficult to know. But I think that I think from what was it, he was cut a pretty miserable figure. I think he was pretty defeated by the end and pretty low. Yeah.
So in September 1327, news reaches London that Edward died suddenly. Now, the most infamous and unlikely story, I mean, in the recent documentary, you said, I'm not even giving it credence.
Yeah.
I'm talking, of course, about the red hot poker where you really don't need one. That story.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I always thought you were talking about his survival. I was like, yeah, not giving that credence either.
No. I'm talking about the red hot poker up the bum death. So where did that story come from? And what do you think it tells us about both Edward's story and the way that it was later perceived? Because surely that death is meant to be, there surely is an element of homophobia there.
Yes. Yes, there is. But what's interesting and what people don't always realise is the story of Edward's sexuality and the story of the poker they're separate. So the poker was an invention by the Brook Chronicler, who was writing later and was trying to find a way of evoking empathy, but also intrigue and like fascination with the death of the king. But he also had to find a way of the king dying without showing any physical signs of being murdered. And so this was what he came up with, but that wasn't unprecedented. Death by anal penetration that's not the first time it's mentioned in any sort of source material. He was borrowing the mythology around Edmund Ironside, who was allegedly killed by going to the toilet and a statue holding an arrow released the arrow and it sort of shot up his backside and that's how he was killed, which is obviously ridiculous. It's completely mad, but it's what people sort of wanted to read. It was sort of quite almost funny. It was almost, yeah, I mean, you laugh because I think people found it funny. I think it's like, and it's ridiculous, but it's farcical, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's
it's
almost
just so
satire.
ridiculous
And
lurid.
and I think that it was borrowed from stories like that. Then there's the story of the soldier, the warrior in 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, who was killed with a spear impaled between his legs. So it's borrowing, it's mimetic literary, it's borrowing narratives from other histories in order to reinforce this particular story. But so that's where the poker myth comes from.
And in reality, he was probably smothered. probably.
Yeah, probably he was probably smothered. But the sexuality, the homosexuality between the two, between Gaveston and Edward, was actually they're the two combined with Christopher Marlowe and his play Edward II. At which point he really does try to create this Edward as a homosexual king who is killed brutally and, yeah, as you say, homophobically.
So my final question for you then is, as I referenced a moment ago, you recently released a documentary on History Hit about Edward II. It's a brilliant documentary, and you explore the notion, was he the worst king in English history? And so my question to you, Helen, is, do you think he was?
No. No, I don't think he was. I definitely don't think he was the worst. I think there are a few more. No, I don't think he was. I don't.
Who do you think
Who do I think
was?
was the worst? Either John or
John.
probably John. I mean, Richard wasn't great either. Richard was pretty bad, but I think John was marginally worse. Richard II, yeah, yeah. But I think that Edward, I don't think he was a bad king. I think he was quite restricted. I think that he was hamstrung in many ways. I think if he'd had a little more freedom, I think he might have made some good decisions. But I think that he was hamstrung by his father's legacy. I think he was hamstrung by expectation, but also his own fallibilities in and his own insecurities in that he couldn't rule independently. He didn't have that strength of character to be able to understand that what his role was king and as it was as king and how he needed to act accordingly and treat it very much like a job and a station rather than an accolade that of his own.
Yeah, well, what makes history so fascinating, and you touched on it earlier, is so much of this comes down to what was the character of the monarch, the king or the queen like. Because characters can change, they can be influenced, but ultimately, some people are just much better suited to ruling. We only need to look at the century after. You get Henry V, probably the most militarily successful monarch in British history, but his son, Henry VI, is a disaster. As you say, character is so crucial. There are some people who are born to it and understand the role in a way that Edward II perhaps just didn't.
I don't think he did. I don't think he had the nature for kingship. I think that kingship requires leadership skills and strength and the ability to be a natural leader, and he wasn't a natural leader. He needed to follow somebody. He needed that. He almost needed to rule with as a sort of cohesive unit with somebody else rather than independently.
Yeah, he'd have made a good constitutional monarch rather than an absolute monarch, I think.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on what is going to be part one of a two-part episode, probably in 2-3 weeks' time. For people who want to keep up to date with what you do, where are you across social media?
Instagram. I don't have the time or the capacity to manage anything else, unfortunately. So I tend to try my best to put everything I'm doing on there. It feels, most things are going on there. So any events and everything all on Instagram. And you can, has links to buy books. I'm trying to sort of indicate where you can get books from and places where I've been signing. So you can get signed copies as well.
And are you able to say what you're working on next?
I'm not really working on anything right now because promoting this one is an absolute full-time job. I mean, I'm very much just focusing on talking about Sceptred Isle at the moment, but I am going to be going on to work on the relationship between England and Scotland, and that's going to be the next big project.
Well, and getting your PhD done as well.
Yeah, that's my thing. I've promised I'm going to finish that next, which actually will feed into the next book. So that's the plan.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Helen, and we will speak again in a few weeks' time.
Great. Nice to see you. Take care.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. My thanks to Helen for coming onto the podcast for the first time. As I said, she'll be back in a couple of weeks' time to pick up the rest of the story. And thank you to you, the listener. In next week's episode, I'm going to be diving back in to the world of Jane Boleyn and talking to Julia Fox about this fascinating woman from the court of King Henry VIII. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak soon.